Hey guys, welcome back. This is lesson 5 in our 8-part video series. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about how we measure student learning, in other words, assessment, which is an essential part of our program. So here's the overview for lesson 5. We're going to start off by defining assessment, and then we are going to talk about the difference between formative and summative assessment. Sounds fun. We're going to talk about different common types of assessments for language learners. We'll talk a little bit about the differences between assessing performance and proficiency. You'll recall in the last lesson we talked about, or lesson 3 I think, we talked about how performance differs from proficiency. We're going to talk about performance assessment tasks, first noting some of their features. Then we'll look at some specific, design elements of performance assessment tasks. And then finally we're going to look at second to last, what an integrated performance assessment, or IPA, is, and we will finish up the lesson by talking about the oral proficiency interview. So let's go ahead and start digging into some of these topics in lesson 5. Alright, so first off, what do we mean by assessment? Well, assessment is just what people used to call tests and quizzes and things like that, right? They're activities that measure students' knowledge, skills, or abilities. So examples of what we call assessment today, some of the common ones, you have your standardized tests like the ACT or the SAT, or you might have an exam at the end of a unit or a chapter, a traditional paper and pencil exam. Quizzes, group projects, essays, and presentations. So these are types of assessments that are very common. Now there's a distinction that's important to know between formative assessment and summative assessment. So let's talk briefly a little bit about that. What is formative assessment? What is it trying to do? Well, formative assessment are activities focused on learning and preparing students, right? So students do formative assessments, they receive feedback regarding the progress they're making toward their objectives, their goals. The purpose is to prepare them for summative assessments. And these formative assessments usually occur as students move through a particular course of study, a unit or a chapter, when there's a summative assessment at the end. They should intend to be low stakes, meaning they don't generate a lot of anxiety because they have little or no impact on the student's grade in the class. Some examples of formative assessments just might be assignments, learning checks, right? Student comes into class, you give them a quick quiz to see if they read the night before, right? Or even practice assessments, assessments that look like the thing that will be high stakes, so that they can get feedback and know how they're progressing. Now, summative assessment, I've already referred to it several times as I explained formative. Summative assessment really is that focus on measuring learning, right? They indicate whether learners have in fact met the goals of instruction for a particular unit or course. They occur at the end, at some significant point of time, usually at the end, maybe midterm, the end of a unit, the end of the course. And they are high stakes. These summative assessments should have a significant impact on a student's final grade. So examples of summative assessments would be things like unit exam, midterms, final exams, right? Group projects, research papers, and things like that. All right, so what are some common assessments that we use in the field of language teaching, right? Well, one researcher out of Brigham Young University named Ray Clifford has differentiated or identified 3 main types. The first type he calls achievement assessments. Now these are the traditional paper and pencil chapter exams or unit exams, right? An achievement assessment is an assessment that's based on rehearsed or memorized responses using the content of a specific textbook or curriculum. So think, again, unit or chapter exam. There's going to be a test at the end of Unit 1, which is chapters 1 through 3, right? Be sure to know all the vocab and the grammar, right? So that's rehearsed, memorized responses from a specific textbook. Do you know it, right? The question for an achievement assessment is, do you know the material? Contrast that with the second type, which is performance assessment. We're going to talk a lot more about this one. So performance assessment, according to Clifford, semi-rehearsed ability to communicate in specific familiar settings. So this meshes with the definition of performance we looked at back in lesson 3. So think of conversations in which students have to accomplish a task using words and structures they've practiced, right? Or maybe a presentation on a familiar topic after having time to research and organize the content. Semi-rehearsed, familiar, some practice involved. And then finally, proficiency assessments, right? As we saw before, proficiency refers to the use of language unrehearsed, right, in spontaneous settings. So proficiency assessment would be unrehearsed general ability to accomplish communication tasks across a wide range of topics and settings. So examples would be the Act for Oral Proficiency interview, or OPI, or an unscripted interview given as a final exam. So this slide right here, if you want to just pause the video, because I'm not going to read it, you can read it, but it's very good. It comes from an ACTFL publication, right? And you can see the differences between assessing performance and assessing proficiency. We do both in our program, with maybe more of an emphasis on assessing performance, which we believe leads to efficiency. So if you want to pause and take a closer look right here, feel free to pause the video. I think this is important content. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about performance assessments, because as you will see, these are super important in our approach to teaching and our design. What do performance assessments usually do, right? They require students to use language to accomplish tasks that they might face in the real world, right? So ordering a meal, for example, or planning a vacation, things you might actually do. Performance assessments should target a specific mode of communication, so presentational or interpretive, and a specific proficiency level or performance range. They need to provide a meaningful context, right? They incorporate, to the extent possible, authentic texts, defined as texts that are written or produced by native speakers for native speakers, okay? And they end up generating genuine acts of communication. One good thing, one benefit is that they show, performance assessments show students how well they can perform when actual communication is needed. And to be a performance assessment as we understand it, they need to be scored and rated using rubrics, right? Mode and level specific rubrics. So again, presentational, speaking at the novice range, right? That specify descriptors for exceeding, meeting, or not meeting expectations. So what we have on this particular screen are just some general features of, yes, we're talking about a performance assessment. All right, here we have 3 examples, simplified, very simplified examples, but just to give you an idea of some performance assessment tasks, what they might look like, things we might use in our program, in our classes. An example of an interpretive task might be that students have to read a text, a newspaper, like a want ad, right? A classified ad in this case, and we're going to ask them to recognize keywords, verify details, and guess what words and phrases mean from context. An interpersonal mode task might ask students to speak in Spanish with their partner about their daily routines or what kinds of foods they like to eat. Remember, familiar topics, especially for the novice mode. And then a presentational task, this is just one example, right? There are infinite possibilities, would be if we ask students to prepare a poster or an infographic in Spanish that lists nutritional information about those foods. So again, they have time to prepare, to organize the material. That's a feature of the presentational mode. So these are just examples of performance assessment tasks that might be assessments that we use in our language classes. All right, so just a little bit more about performance assessment tasks. Some of this might be a little bit repetitive, but it's okay. They target a specific mode of communication and proficiency level. They incorporate themes, functions, structures, and vocabulary that students have recently practiced. This is more for the benefit of if you have to design one, right? They're going to contextualize that situation, provide some kind of plausible real-world scenario. So pretend that you're meeting with your friend after class and you're going to discuss your daily routine, something like that's, I guess that's not that plausible, but you can probably think of something even better. A well-designed performance assessment task is going to provide clear instructions to the student. So it's going to tell the student what they need to do procedurally, logistically. Do they record the task? Do they work with a partner? How much time do they have? They're going to tell them if there are certain grammar structures, communicative functions, or vocabulary that they should incorporate. And they're going to list any other requirements. For example, speak for at least 2 minutes or write at least 100 words. And then, to be well designed, a performance assessment task, we're also going to provide to the students information about how that task, how their performance on the task is going to be evaluated. So we're going to provide a rubric with the criteria, the categories, and the descriptors. So students know, oh, to meet expectations or to exceed expectations, I need to do this at this level. It's not a secret. We want them to know. Okay, so let's continue speaking about performance assessment and speak about a particular performance assessment called the Integrated Performance Assessment, which is an assessment that was designed by ACTFL. They call it a cluster assessment. And each IPA, each Integrated Performance Assessment, is designed to target one of the 4 proficiency levels, remember, right? Novice, intermediate, advanced, and superior, okay? Students complete 3 tasks. That's why it's a cluster assessment, right? 1 task for each mode of communication. So they might do the interpretive task one day, and then a class period later they do the interpersonal task, and then the next time the class meets they might do the presentational task. The tasks share a common theme. So maybe it is travel, or eating out, right? Or transportation, right? Or jobs. And the tasks are interrelated and they build upon each other. We embed culture through the use of authentic texts. Remember, texts that are produced for native speakers by native speakers. The culture is embedded in those texts. So here's sort of a graphic presentation or representation of how the performance assessment works. You can, again, pause the presentation, pause the video here if you want to take a little bit closer look. I think you should, because we really want you to understand how IPAs work. All right, another just quick note about the IPA is that for the interpretive task, a template is used. And in the department, we modify this somewhat, but it looks like this. So the task is for the student to take the authentic text and to complete the template by interpreting that text. And then, as I mentioned before, on an IPA or any good performance assessment, you're going to evaluate each task using rubrics with descriptors that indicate different levels of performance. And you're going to share the rubric with the student before they prepare for the task. So you can see an example that ACTFL has published for the interpersonal mode novice learner. So again, feel free to pause the video and take a closer look. Okay, and then our final topic in this video, lesson 7, is the oral proficiency interview. So we're shifting from performance to proficiency. The OPI, you've probably heard of it already, so this might be review. The OPI is an unscripted interaction that resembles a free-flowing conversation. It's not tied to any particular course or curriculum or textbook or anything like that. So there's not a 101 OPI or a Conectate Spanish program from McGraw-Hill OPI. The purpose of the OPI is to elicit a rateable speech sample, a sample that can be listened to by a trained rater and given one of the sub-level ratings on the proficiency scale. So the OPI consists of 4 phases. There's a warm-up, which sets the interviewee at ease. He asks some basically easy questions. And then it moves into the level checks, where the purpose is to establish what can the interviewee do fairly easily, confidently, comfortably. What's their floor? And then the probes begin, which are used to establish the ceiling, right? At what point does that communication break down? At what point can the interviewee not effectively communicate anymore? And then the wind down, because you want the interviewee, the student in this case, the learner, to finish on a positive note, to have a sense of accomplishment. So you bring the interview back down to a level where they perform with ease, comfort, and accuracy. Okay, so that's a typical oral proficiency interview. And for certain more advanced levels, right, if you think the person might be advanced or superior, those also include a role play scenario. Okay. The interview is recorded and the samples compared to level-specific criteria so that a final rating or grade can be determined. So in our Spanish program at this level, 101 through 202, we don't use the oral proficiency interview, but we do incorporate a final OPI style interview. So at the end of the semester, you're going to interview your students or perhaps somebody else's students, and you won't have a script. You're just going to try to converse with the person, right? Do a level check, see where they're comfortable, go up to where communication breaks down, right? And then determine, are they novice mid? Are they novice high? Are they perhaps intermediate low? All right, I'm going to start out by thanking you for bearing with me because I know that was kind of a long lesson, but assessment, right? Measuring our student learning is a super important part of our program. And so it was time well spent, trust me. We're going to move on then to lesson 6, which as you can see has to do with teaching, right? What we do in the classroom and sort of our philosophy behind what we do. So let's move on to lesson 6.